Hey guys, tonight we're going to spend the evening as a Victorian child, which means before the morning is out, you'll have been strapped into starched linen, corrected for slouching, tested on your Bible verses, and handed a plate of something gray and educational that the cook has been calling porridge on a technicality. The Victorians were absolutely sincere in their belief that childhood was a sacred preparation for a serious adulthood. They just happened to conduct that preparation with the warmth of a military inspection and the flexibility of a marble pillar. Tonight we're tracing the peculiar logic of an era that coined the word childhood as a concept worth celebrating, then immediately set about filling it with cold baths, rote memorization, and the suggestion that joy was the first step toward moral ruin. This is the story of the smallest people in the strictest world that ever convinced itself, with genuine feeling, that it was acting out of love. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know what Victorian childhood punishment you think you'd have earned: excessive daydreaming, impertinence, slouching, or perhaps what Nanny Briggs would diplomatically refer to as a troubling tendency toward personal opinions. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that gentle white noise and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Tonight, someone has already made that decision for you, tucked in firmly, on three sides, by a woman who believes fresh air is healthy and coziness is self-indulgence. You'll manage. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a toddler in a corset? Or what Victorian children were supposed to eat for breakfast, and whether it qualifies as breakfast by any standard a reasonable person would accept? Have you ever wondered what a Victorian nanny actually did all day, and how she maintained 17 simultaneous behavioral regulations in her head, while a 7-year-old was methodically dismantling the coal scuttle for reasons known only to him? Have you ever wondered what the phrase "seen and not heard" looked like in practice every meal, every drawing room visit, every Sunday, or what happened when a child couldn't quite manage it? Have you ever wondered what working-class children the same age as the nursery children were doing at 7 in the morning while Master Edmund was conjugating Latin verbs? Or what doctors were quietly putting in the teething drops, and whether it explains rather a lot? Good. All of that is tonight. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1872 on the 3rd floor of a respectable terraced house in Kensington, London. The room smells of coal smoke, carbolic soap, and something faintly sweet and slightly wrong that you will eventually identify as the calming drops the nurse has added to the baby's bottle in the corner. Outside, London is assembling itself in the gray fog, the clatter of the milk cart on the cobbles, the distant call of the coal man, the first church bell of the morning cutting through the damp air like a reminder that God, too, is already up and has expectations. You are 7 years old. You have been awake for 4 minutes. You already have a schedule. Nanny Briggs is standing at the foot of your bed with the expression of a woman who has never once, in 40 years, allowed a morning to proceed at its own pace. Good morning. Try to look presentable. Let's set the scene. The Victorian nursery is a world unto itself, and if you've never had occasion to examine one closely, let me be the first to tell you, it is not what you'd call an inspiring environment for a developing human mind, unless you believe that development is best achieved through rigidity, discomfort, and the persistent smell of pine tar soap. You take it in from the doorway, a high-ceilinged room with 2 tall sash windows that let in gray light in the mornings and absolutely nothing else, because the curtains have been drawn against the cold and also, one suspects, against the possibility of distraction. There is a fireplace, but it's behind a heavy iron guard, because children and fire are a combination that every Victorian adult understood from first-hand experience. There is a table with 4 straight-backed chairs, a washstand with a ceramic basin and a jug, a wooden toy chest that opens grudgingly, as if it too has developed opinions about whether playtime is really warranted. On the mantelpiece, between a china dog and a framed, improving verse about industry and obedience, sits Pudding, the household's large, entirely indifferent tabby cat, who has evidently decided that the nursery's strict rules do not apply to him and has settled in for a morning nap with the self-possession of someone who has never once been corrected for slouching. The nursery in a respectable Victorian household is not the cozy, padded cell vision you might expect. It's a department, a separate administrative unit. In upper-class houses, the nursery has its own kitchen, its own staff, its own meal times, and its own gravitational pull that keeps children well away from the polished rooms below where adults conduct their adult affairs. The children who live up here, you, in this version of events, exist in an almost entirely parallel domestic world, cared for by Nanny Briggs and, increasingly, by Miss Price the governess, and brought downstairs at appointed times for inspection by your parents, like a quarterly report. Nobody is quite sure they wanted to read. Spoiler: no covers a remarkable amount of territory. The room has its own sounds, too, once you learn to hear them. The deep creak of the floorboards when Nanny Briggs crosses to the window, the tick of the small clock on the mantelpiece that marks every quarter hour with the authority of someone who has been tracking time since before you were born, the soft settling of the coal in the grate behind its iron guard, the occasional determined sound of baby Clara working out her feelings in the corner. These are the sounds of a contained world, a world that has edges, and there is something in the having of edges that is, depending on the day, either deeply comforting or slightly suffocating. And yet, and this is the thing that takes you a moment to feel, there is something about this room. It is not warm. Exactly. Warmth is managed and rationed, like coal. It is not soft. The furniture would not describe itself as soft. But there is the smell of porridge drifting up from the nursery kitchen. There is Pudding, who has claimed the warmest spot with his usual magnificent indifference. There is the cradle by the window where baby Clara is sleeping, with the focused determination of someone who has not yet been told the rules, and the morning light catching the edge of the curtain in a thin line of pale gold. Somewhere in this room, a child lived. Maybe many children. And whatever the adults thought they were doing, whatever the schedule and the corsets and the improving verses on the mantelpiece, a life was being built here, quietly, between the corrections. Welcome to the nursery. Try not to fidget. Nanny Briggs has eyes in the back of her head, and she has made this very clear on multiple previous occasions. Let's talk about Nanny Briggs, because if you're going to understand what Victorian childhood actually felt like from the inside, you need to understand that the most powerful adult in your day-to-day existence is not your mother, not your father, and certainly not Queen Victoria, who is a long way away and busy with her own particular version of managing grief and empire. The most powerful adult in your life is a woman in a white cap with a posture so perfect it makes other people feel apologetic about their spines. Her full name is Agnes Briggs, though nobody calls her Agnes. She has been a nursery maid, then an under-nurse, then a head nurse over the course of 30 years, and she has raised 11 children across 4 households. And she would like you to know that she has seen worse than you, much worse, and that she has on every single occasion prevailed. She is somewhere in her late 50s. She smells of lavender water and mild authority. She has never in her professional life been uncertain about anything. You encounter Nanny Briggs first thing every morning, when she arrives to oversee washing, dressing, hairbrushing, and the performance of morning prayers. All of these activities have correct and incorrect versions, and she knows every single one. The water in the basin will be cold, or at best cool, because warm water is understood by Nanny Briggs to be the first step on a long road toward moral softness. You do not argue about the water temperature. You wash in it. You do not make a face. Spoiler, you make a face. It makes no difference. Victorian nannies occupied a fascinating and slightly vertiginous social position. They were servants, paid staff, dependent on the household for their livelihood. But inside the nursery, they were absolute monarchs. They outranked the cook in daily authority over their charges. In many families, they had more influence over how a child's character actually developed than the child's own parents, who descended from the adult world for 1 hour each evening, kissed their children on the foreheads, admired their manners, and retreated again, genuinely believing that this was the right amount of parenting. Which means Nanny Briggs knows you better than your parents do. She knows you hate the texture of cooked carrots, though she serves them anyway because vegetables build constitution. She knows you have a habit of hiding things under the seat cushion of the window chair and removes them with the implacability of a customs official. She knows you talk in your sleep, not words, exactly, but sounds of negotiation, as if the dream version of you is trying to get out of something, and she knows this because she checks on you at 11 and again at 2, and she has done this for 7 years, and she has never mentioned it, and she never will. She knows, crucially, that you are the sort of child who will test a rule exactly once to see if it holds. It holds. And yet, and this is the thing about Nanny Briggs that takes you a while to understand, she is not cruel. She is exacting. She is inflexible. She operates on a set of convictions about children's welfare that are, by our standards, approximately as nuanced as a brick wall. But she genuinely believes that what she is doing, the cold water, the straight spine, the no-nonsense meals, and the regular prayers, and the early bedtimes, is making you safer, healthier, better equipped for a world she knows from experience is not gentle to the unprepared. Pudding does not seem to be subject to any of Nanny Briggs's behavioral requirements, a fact you have noted with deep and abiding resentment since approximately age 4. The real Nanny Briggs, and she is a real type, documented in hundreds of Victorian memoirs, letters, and domestic guides, was often the most consistent adult presence in an upper or middle-class child's life. In a time of high adult mortality and economic instability, the nanny was the fixed point. Children who despised her at 7 wrote about her with something close to reverence at 70. She was, in the truest sense, the person who raised them, and whatever her methods, she showed up every single morning, even when the water was cold, especially when the water was cold. Let's be clear, Victorian parenting was not simply a set of preferences or guidelines. It was a doctrine, a codified, published, vigorously debated ideology about what children were, what they required, and what would happen to them, morally, physically, and spiritually if they were handled incorrectly. It was, in short, a field, and the Victorians approached it with the same systematic enthusiasm they applied to railway engineering, empire administration, and the classification of beetles. You could buy books about it, many books, more books than you'd expect. Mrs. Isabella Beeton's famous Book of Household Management devotes considerable attention to the management of children and reads approximately like an HR manual for a small and unreliable workforce. The central premise of Victorian child-rearing, the idea that underpins everything, is this: children are not small people. They are unfinished people. They arrive in a state of moral and intellectual incompleteness, prone to passion, selfishness, laziness, and what the religious literature calls willfulness. And it is the solemn duty of every adult around them to work, daily and without sentimentality, on that incompleteness. The goal is not happiness. The goal is character. Spoiler: character and happiness are considered, in many households, to be mutually exclusive. This produces a rule set that appears to have been designed by someone who found joy slightly embarrassing. Children should not run in the house. Children should not raise their voices. Children should not speak at meals unless addressed. Children should sit upright. Children should finish everything on their plate. Children should not display emotion excessively, not grief, not excitement, not, God forbid, boredom. Children should not be idle. Children should not walk with their hands in their pockets, should not read at the dinner table, should not ask questions about money, and should on no account ever be found doing nothing, because nothing is where wickedness starts, and wickedness is where everything else ends. Idleness and the first cousin of wickedness share a guest room, and they have been known to invite friends. The dominant child-rearing philosophy of the early Victorian period, influenced heavily by evangelicalism, and the writing of people like John Wesley, holds that children are born with wills that must be broken or bent, not unlike a young horse, before they can become decent adults. The will is the enemy of virtue. Desire is the enemy of discipline. The job of the parent is not to cultivate what the child already is, but to suppress what the child naturally is and replace it with something better. By the 1870s, this is softening slightly. Froebel's kindergarten philosophy is trickling over from Germany. A few progressive voices suggesting that maybe children have some inherent goodness worth nurturing rather than overriding. But these voices have not yet reached Nanny Briggs, who finds these new ideas about child psychology mildly alarming, like someone suggesting she reorganize the medicine cabinet by color. Young Master Edmund, who is 7 and possessed of an entirely natural curiosity about how things work, has run into the rules approximately 400 times this year alone. He has been corrected for asking why, corrected for not asking why when he was expected to demonstrate intellectual engagement, corrected for fidgeting, for spitting, for making what Nanny Briggs describes as that face, for encouraging Pudding to sit on his Latin primer, and for an incident involving the coal scuttle that no one in the household is prepared to discuss in specific detail. He is, in other words, a perfectly ordinary 7-year-old, which means that he is, by the standards of 1872, an ongoing project. He knows it. He has known it for years. That's the thing about growing up inside a system this explicit. You understand your status very early, not with bitterness, usually, just with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has learned the rules of a game they didn't choose but fully intend to survive. Let's start with who's actually here, because a Victorian nursery does not contain only one child, and a Victorian childhood is not a solo endeavor. It's a densely populated social ecosystem, and knowing who's in it matters considerably to how you spend your days. Edmund, you've already met, in a manner of speaking. He's 7, with dark hair that Nanny Briggs combs into rigid submission every morning and that reasserts itself into complete chaos by 10 o'clock without fail. He is the second child in the household. His older sister Eleanor is 11 and has been promoted out of the nursery into the schoolroom full-time, which means Edmund sees her mainly at mealtimes and during the brief window of free play that follows afternoon lessons. The promotion is treated in the household with something approaching ceremony. Eleanor now takes her meals differently, carries herself with a new quality of self-consciousness, and inhabits a slightly adjusted version of the same rooms that suggests she is being practiced at being a young woman and is not entirely sure what she thinks about the rehearsal. Edmund watches this with the curiosity of someone studying a process that will eventually be applied to himself in a different form, and finding it instructive and slightly alarming in equal measure. Baby Clara occupies the cradle. She is 11 months old and spends her days cycling through the narrow emotional repertoire available to 11-month-olds: contentment, confusion, and furious outrage at delays in the feeding schedule. She is, by some measures, the only person in the household operating entirely on her own agenda, and she does so with complete conviction. Nanny Briggs tends to her with a brisk, experienced competence that looks from the outside like love and probably is. Pudding, who appeared on the mantelpiece in Chapter 1 and has shown no signs of leaving, is a large, marmalade-colored tabby of indeterminate age and very definite opinions about personal space, which he regards as entirely his own. He arrived in the nursery approximately 3 years ago during an incident that no longer matters, and stayed because the coal fire corner is warm, and the nursery maid leaves the cream uncovered with a regularity that suggests she has given up. Pudding does not follow the nursery rules. This is his chief attraction. He sleeps on Edmund's pillow when Nanny Briggs is not watching, and Edmund allows it because Pudding's magnificent disregard for authority is both inspiring and slightly comforting. And then there is Hetty Gill. Hetty is 8, the daughter of Mrs. Gill the cook, and she lives in the basement kitchen world. That is, in many ways, as separate from Edmund's nursery world as the nursery is from the adult drawing rooms. She doesn't belong in the nursery. The household social order is perfectly clear on this point, but she has a habit of appearing in it anyway during the gray mid-afternoon hours, when Cook has sent her up with a message or a tray, and Nanny Briggs has briefly stepped out to manage some other corner of the household. She is sharp, small, and possessed of an extremely practical intelligence that Edmund, who has been learning French verbs all morning, finds completely overwhelming and rather wonderful. Hetty knows how to do things. She knows how to get coal without making noise, how to make a whistle from a piece of grass, how to tell from the color of the sky whether tomorrow's washing will actually dry. She has no Latin and no piano lessons and no governess, and she will start work in domestic service by the time she's 12, and she is aware of all of this with a clarity that Edmund, in his nursery, is not. Their friendship is unofficial, irregular, and apparently inexplicable to everyone except themselves. Miss Price rounds out the household's cast, but she deserves her own chapter, and she'll get it. For now, she is the governess, arrived 8 months ago from an advertisement in the Times, with a posture that suggests years of carrying invisible books on her head and opinions about irregular verbs that border on the personal. Together, this is the world of the nursery. A system of carefully defined relationships, each person in their station, each station with its rules, with Pudding occupying no station whatsoever and remaining completely comfortable with this arrangement. In 1872, even the cat knows who he is. He just doesn't particularly care. Let's talk about the schedule, because the Victorian Child's Day is a piece of logistical architecture that would not look out of place at a medium-security corrections facility, except the corrections facility probably has more unstructured time and slightly more interesting food. The day begins before you are fully conscious of it beginning. At 6:30, sometimes earlier in summer, when the light doesn't get the memo about sleeping in, you are awake, because Nanny Briggs is already present and has opened the curtain with the kind of purposeful efficiency that treats the concept of easing into the morning with polite contempt. There is washing, which is cold. There is dressing, which is complicated. There are prayers, which are brief but non-negotiable. By 7 o'clock, you are seated in the nursery at the table, eating breakfast, with both elbows off the surface and your back not touching the chair. Breakfast in the nursery is plain bread and butter, a cup of weak tea or warm milk, and possibly porridge if the morning is cold, which it usually is. There is no toast with jam unless it is a special occasion. And in a household run by Nanny Briggs, special occasion is defined narrowly enough to include good behavior, a birthday, and possibly the second coming. Edmund once described the porridge as gray, and the resulting correction is now part of nursery folklore. After breakfast come lessons. In the nursery, these are conducted initially by Nanny Briggs' alphabet, sums, basic reading, and by the age of 5 or 6, increasingly by Miss Price, who arrives at 9 o'clock with a leather-bound lesson book and the focused energy of someone who has been awake since dawn preparing. Lessons run until noon, with a 10-minute break at mid-morning that is not, under any circumstances, to be confused with play. Noon brings the main meal of the nursery day, a simpler version of whatever the adults are having downstairs, processed through Nanny Briggs's nutritional principles and the nursery kitchen's interpretation of same. After the meal, there is a rest period. Younger children nap, older children sit quietly, and quietly means quietly. Pudding uses this time to sleep on the warm spot by the fire, with the completeness of someone who has fully made peace with the concept of rest. The afternoon brings more lessons, or on favored days, outdoor exercise. Victorian child-rearing literature is relatively unanimous that children need fresh air and physical exercise, though physical exercise in this context means a structured walk rather than anything resembling exuberance. Edmund and Eleanor walk with Nanny Briggs in Hyde Park at a pace designed to improve their circulation while not encouraging them to actually enjoy the experience. The posture is upright. The enjoyment is implied rather than visible. 5 o'clock is the most significant social event of the nursery day. The children are taken downstairs to the drawing room to visit their parents. You are dressed for it. You are reminded of the behavioral expectations relevant to it. You are presented to your father, who asks about your lessons, and your mother, who kisses you and might read to you or ask you to demonstrate something, a scale on the piano, a verse, a French sentence. It is like an audition that you have not been told you are auditioning for, and nobody quite acknowledges that it has a score. If Edmund answers the question correctly, his father says good and moves on. If Edmund answers incorrectly, there is a pause, a particular quality of pause that is not angry, not exactly, but that contains something more than silence and then a gentle correction, and then good, and then moving on. Then you come back upstairs for nursery, supper, bread and milk or cold meat, and then bath, and then prayers, and then bed. By 7:30 the nursery is dark, and whatever Edmund has been thinking about all day, the cloud that looked like a horse, the thing Hetty said about the kitchen cat, the way the Latin word for table sounds completely wrong for what a table actually is, he is left alone with it in the dark, and the house settles around him, and pudding picks his way silently across the end of the bed, and outside, London keeps going without him. This is every day, and given the alternatives, it kind of is a good and orderly childhood. Let's not forget the clothes, because one of the most immediately striking things about Victorian children, one of the things that makes you understand in a single look what this era believed childhood was, is that the Victorians dressed their children as if they were hosting a formal dinner at all times, including during what they technically called play. You are dressed this morning in layers. There are always layers, starting from your skin and working outward. First, a linen undershirt, then drawers, then stockings, wool, held up by a complicated arrangement of garter and tape that you have been managing since you were 5 and still consider unnecessarily hostile to the human leg. Then a flannel petticoat because warmth, then a chemise because propriety. Then and here is the part that takes a moment to process for younger children of both sexes, possibly a pair of stays. Not full whalebone corsets, not yet, but something like a structured bodice, boned lightly, that holds the torso upright and trains the spine into its socially acceptable position, which is to say, the position of a person who has never once considered leaning back. If you are a girl, this will eventually become an actual corset. Your posture will be understood to be a moral statement as much as a physical one, and the corset its enforcement mechanism, like a note from authority that your body carries around at all times. If you are a boy, like Edmund, the stays phase typically ends between 4 and 6, when you are breeched, moved out of dresses, which all young children wore, regardless of sex, until approximately age 4 or 5, and into trousers. The breeching ceremony is celebrated with genuine formality in middle and upper class households, attended to with a solemnity that suggests the child is being knighted rather than put into different legwear. The father, who has been a distant figure in the nursery world, is usually more present on this occasion. It is, specifically, his ceremony, the moment the male child is handed over from the world of nurses and mothers to the world of men, in principle, if not yet in practice. Edmund barely remembers his, but there is apparently a photograph somewhere in the house, and he is wearing an expression that his mother describes as distinguished and that Nanny Briggs describes as suspicious. Over all of this go the outer garments, a shirt with a white collar, stiff and starched, and approximately as comfortable as wearing a dinner plate around your neck. The starch is the thing you notice most acutely at first, not the weight of it, but the texture, the way the fabric sits away from the skin rather than settling against it, so that the collar is technically touching you without ever quite meeting you, like a very formal acquaintance. A jacket, trousers, sturdy button boots, because shoes are insufficient for the serious business of 1,872. Now, you can play in all of this, in a manner of speaking. What you cannot do is play in the way that involves rolling in grass, or climbing things in any committed way, or doing anything that would require Nanny Briggs to spend the afternoon ironing. Spoiler: Edmund rolls in grass. This is why he has a second set of trousers. There's a historical irony here worth sitting with for a moment. The Victorian era was precisely when childhood, as a distinct phase of life with its own requirements, its own culture, its own precious character, was being actively romanticized. Dickens was writing about it. Lewis Carroll was photographing it. Childhood, as a special and sacred thing, was being elevated to something like a national treasure. And yet the children themselves were being dressed in miniature adult clothing, measured by adult behavioral standards, and expected to inhabit a miniature adult social world. The era idealized childhood, and then immediately applied conditions to it that rather undermined the ideal, like writing a beautiful poem about the sea and then immediately scheduling it. Pudding, who is wearing nothing and has no plans to change this, watches the morning dressing ritual with the impassive expression of someone who has made very different choices and considers them vindicated. And yet the children wore their clothes and grew up in them, and, for the most part, did not know to wish for anything different. Edmund is not suffering. Not exactly. He is buttoned up and correct, and slightly too warm, and perfectly, ordinarily alive, inside all of it. The buttons, though, there are always more buttons than you expect. Always. Let's talk about food, because Victorian nursery food is a subject that is either funny or tragic, depending on how hungry you are, and the honest answer is probably both at once. The guiding principle of Victorian nursery cuisine, if we extend cuisine the charity of applying it here, is plainness. Not simplicity in the artisanal sense. Plainness as a moral category. The nursery kitchen operates on the belief that rich food, spiced food, sweet food, interesting food, food that has opinions about itself, is bad for children. Children are developing systems, digestive, nervous, moral. They should not be excited by their meals. They should be fueled by their meals. There is a difference, and Nanny Briggs is clear on which side of it the nursery operates. Breakfast you already know. Porridge or bread and butter. Weak tea or milk. Plain, efficient. The sort of meal you eat because your body has made clear this is non-negotiable. Dinner, the main meal, at noon, is more substantial, but no more interesting. Plain boiled mutton is a staple. The kind of mutton that has been in the pot long enough to have fully reconsidered whatever it was before it was mutton. Boiled vegetables, carrots, turnips, potatoes are another. The boiling is done until any lingering character has been thoroughly eliminated, until the carrot is no longer a carrot in the assertive sense, but a memory of a carrot, pale and resigned. A good Victorian nursery vegetable does not taste of itself. It tastes of having given up. There is sometimes a pudding, which sounds exciting right up until you understand that pudding in this context means something like a steamed sponge or a baked custard made without enough sugar to constitute enjoyment, and served with a thin sauce that aspires to be cream and hasn't quite got there. Supper is bread and milk. If you have been especially good or especially unwell, it might be arrowroot, a thin, slightly gelatinous gruel made from a tropical root plant, which Victorian adults genuinely believed to be both nutritious and digestible, and which children uniformly understood to be the food equivalent of a gray Tuesday in a room with no windows. The bread and milk, when you get it, has its own particular texture. The bread softens and begins to disintegrate into the milk in a way that is neither liquid nor solid, but a third thing that has given up on the distinction, and it is served warm. And if you hold the bowl in both hands, the warmth is actually quite pleasant, which is perhaps the most enthusiastic endorsement that nursery supper has ever received. There are rules about eating, separate from the rules about food. You do not begin until grace is said. You do not leave anything on your plate. You do not comment on the food positively or negatively. You eat what is before you with an expression of grateful equanimity, because gratitude for one's meals is a character virtue. And if Edmund cannot manage grateful equanimity, he can at least manage neutral adequacy, which is close enough for a Wednesday. In slightly wealthier households, there is sometimes the indulgence of cake or biscuits on Saturday afternoons. These moments are remembered, decades later, with a disproportionate intensity that tells you everything you need to know about the emotional weight carried by small pleasures inside large restrictions. Hetty, in the kitchen below, eats what the servants eat, plainer, in some ways, more of it, with less ceremony and more noise. She is not going hungry. She is, in some respects, eating better than Edmund, and she knows it, and would not trade his nursery table for hers, because she has seen the expression you have to wear with the turnip, and better is more complicated than it looks. Pudding, for his part, has located the nursery butter dish. Nobody has addressed this directly. The situation continues. The interesting thing about Victorian nursery food, the thing underneath the gray plainness of it, is the genuine care it represents. The adults who specified these diets believed they were protecting children from digestive crises, from overexcitement, from bad habits that would follow a child into adult life. The plainness was love, expressed through refusal, which is a very Victorian sentence, and also, you suspect, a very human one. Let's talk about the medicine, because no discussion of Victorian children is complete without a frank accounting of what the adults were doing to them in the name of health. The Victorian era sits at an interesting and occasionally alarming point in medical history. Germ theory has been established by the 1870s. Pasteur and Koch have done their foundational work, but it has not yet fully propagated into domestic medicine. Household health practice in 1872 is a layered sediment of actual emerging science, ancient folk wisdom, confident misinformation, and the extraordinary commercial energy of an era that had just figured out you could put almost anything in a bottle, call it a remedy, and sell it to anxious parents who were watching their children get sick with a frequency that would give any modern parent a full nervous collapse. And children do get sick, a lot, with a regularity that is genuinely heartbreaking. In 1872, roughly 1 in 5 children will die before their 5th birthday. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, typhoid, these are not distant threats or statistical abstractions. They move through neighborhoods, through nurseries, with the unhurried confidence of something that knows it has nowhere else to be. Every Victorian parent who has more than one child has probably lost one. The high infant mortality of the Victorian era is not background color. It is the psychic weather that every decision about children gets made in. The strictness, the schedules, the cold baths, none of it is arbitrary. All of it is an attempt by frightened adults to produce a child sturdy enough to survive. It is also worth noting what the water situation is in London in 1872, because it is relevant to why so many children are sick so often. The city's sewage system, the great work of Bazalgette's new sewers, is more advanced than it was a decade ago, after the great stink of 1858 finally motivated everyone to address the problem. But clean water is not yet guaranteed everywhere, and the connection between contaminated water and diseases like typhoid and cholera is only recently being established in ways that are changing domestic practice. Nanny Briggs boils the water for Edmund's drinking because she has been told to, and she has been told to because someone in the household has read something, and the something is correct, though the full theoretical understanding behind it is still assembling itself. The cold bath, for instance. This is not sadism. This is hydrotherapy, a serious, widely accepted medical theory holding that cold water hardens the body against illness, improves circulation, toughens the constitution. The shock to the system, which 7-year-old Edmund has been experiencing since he was 2 and still objects to with every fiber of his being, is the point. Then there are the remedies. Victorian chemists' shelves contain a range of preparations that the 21st century would view with considerable concern. Teething is addressed by various means: rubbing the gums, providing hard objects to chew, cold coral pieces on a necklace, and, quite frequently, the administration of preparations known by cheerful names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup or Daffy's elixir, which contain alcohol and opium tincture, and which are, in retrospect, quite effective at making a distressed baby quiet down. If by quite effective you mean chemically sedating an infant, which in 1872 nobody does mean because nobody has yet framed it that way, laudanum tincture of opium is standard household medicine. It is in the medicine cabinet right now. It is given to children for colic, for teething pain, for general distress, for persistent crying that is keeping the household awake. Nobody thinks this is a problem. Spoiler, they eventually think this is a problem. For older children, remedies range from the harmless warm flannel on the stomach, mustard plasters, to the bracing purging remains, a popular medical intervention, to the actively alarming, like the calomel mercury chloride that sits in many nursery medical kits. And yet, children survive. Most of them survive. And Nanny Briggs keeps the nursery clean with carbolic soap. She insists on hand washing with a thoroughness that predates the germ theory vocabulary, but implements its basic principles. She is, by the standards available to her, doing quite a lot of things right. Pudding has never been ill in his life, which Nanny Briggs observes with the professional interest of someone quietly considering whether to adopt the cat's approach to wellness. And young Edmund, for all the cold water and the gray porridge and the careful management of his developing constitution, is healthy. Not robust in the way a child who runs barefoot through summer fields is healthy, but present, functioning, alive, which in 1872 is genuinely worth noting, and which Nanny Briggs notes every morning at the foot of the bed. Let's talk about Miss Price, because she deserves a chapter all her own, and also because she is, in some ways, the most complicated person in this house. She arrives at 9 o'clock precisely, every weekday morning, carrying a leather satchel that contains a lesson book, 2 sharpened pencils, a Latin primer, a volume of selected French phrases for daily use, and what Edmund privately thinks of as her face, the expression of a person who has anticipated every possible source of difficulty in the coming hour and has already formulated a measured response to each one, like a chess player who has thought 14 moves ahead and found all of them acceptable. Miss Edith Price is 31 years old, the daughter of a clergyman who died leaving very little money and 6 daughters, which in the Victorian economy is the equivalent of leaving your family a moderately sized problem with no return policy. Becoming a governess is what happens to educated women of the middle class when their circumstances narrow, not domestic service. Exactly, the governess occupies a social purgatory between servant and family member, belonging fully to neither but paid work in a household, teaching the children in exchange for board, some salary, and the kind of professional respect that is always one household reorganization away from being reconsidered. The governess position is, by most accounts, one of the lonelier occupations available in 1872. You live in the household, but not with the household. You eat in the schoolroom rather than the servants' hall or the dining room. You are above the servants socially and therefore not one of them, and below the family socially and therefore not one of them either, which means the hours between lessons, the evenings, the weekends belong to no one in particular and must be managed alone. Miss Price's evenings are spent in her small room on the 2nd floor with her books. She reads widely, more widely than anyone in the household would guess, and with whatever letters she writes home to her surviving sisters, which are careful and informative and affectionate, and do not include the sentence, "I am sometimes, in the evenings, very alone." Though this sentence is true and the sisters would know it was true, and probably nothing would change if it were written. Victorian literature is full of governesses, and there's a reason they're usually either mad or in love. The position has a particular emotional texture that encourages both. Miss Price is neither, as far as Edmund can determine. She is competent, composed, and slightly unreachable. She knows French, German, Italian mostly, history, English grammar, arithmetic, watercolor painting, piano, and a significant amount of moral philosophy. She teaches Edmund Latin, French, arithmetic, history, Bible, reading, writing, and English composition, and Eleanor 11 and preparing for the social world. Additionally, piano, watercolor, and needlework. This last of which Miss Price teaches with the quiet resignation of someone who is very good at something they never particularly wanted to be good at. The schoolroom is the nursery table repurposed the same room, the same chairs, but the moral atmosphere shifts when Miss Price arrives. It becomes more formal, more vertical. Edmund sits up straighter without being asked, because the air in the room, when Miss Price occupies it, is the air of a space where sitting up straight is simply what happens. Lessons proceed by rote. You repeat. You are corrected. You repeat correctly. You are moved to the next thing. This is not a Socratic dialogue. The goal is the deposit of knowledge into the mind of the child, and the method is repetition and correction. Edmund once asked Miss Price why Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon specifically with the army he had, rather than a larger one. She paused for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations, and then she answered carefully, accurately, in more detail than he expected, and then they returned to the conjugation they had been doing. That pause was, perhaps, the most human moment of the school morning. Edmund replayed it several times that afternoon. The governess system is often criticized now, and not without reason. It was educationally rigid, socially isolating for both teacher and students, and structurally dependent on the economic desperation of educated women with limited options. But the governess was frequently the most intellectually serious adult in a child's life, the person who introduced them to languages, to history, to music, to the vast body of accumulated human knowledge. Miss Price has read more than anyone else Edmund will ever live with. And Edmund, who asks questions that make her pause, who learns the French verb tables faster than she expects, is, she has privately concluded, not the worst assignment she's had, not even close. This is the highest praise in Miss Price's register. He would be thrilled if he knew. Let's be clear about what education means in 1872, because it doesn't mean what we mean when we use the word, and the gap between the two definitions is where a lot of historical comedy quietly lives. Education, in the Victorian nursery and schoolroom, is not primarily about the development of independent thinking. You can relax on that front. It is about the acquisition of specific skills and bodies of knowledge, fixed, mappable, checkable, that will equip the child for their adult role. And what their adult role is depends, with the precision of a sorting machine, on their sex, their class, and their family's specific position within that class. For a boy like Edmund, education is preparation for the serious world, eventually school, then possibly university, then a profession or commerce or the management of some portion of the enterprise of being a Victorian Englishman. The Latin primer is not an intellectual adventure, it is a credential. The ability to read Caesar, in the original, is a signal to other educated men and employers that you are of a certain type and formation. You learn it because you need to have learned it, not because it's interesting, though Edmund, who has noticed that the Latin words for things are often surprisingly specific and occasionally alarming in their precision, finds it more interesting than the curriculum intends. Boys from households like Edmund's, who do not go abroad to the great public schools, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, may encounter there a system of organized peer management known as fagging, in which junior boys serve older ones as a kind of institutional hierarchy, performing personal errands and domestic tasks under the supervision of a prefect who may or may not use a cane for motivational purposes. Edmund does not yet know about this. He will find out. He will have feelings about it, that he will manage in the correct way. For a girl like Eleanor, education is preparation for the domestic and social world, household management, the entertainment of guests, the raising of future children, and the performance of accomplishments, the specific set of skills that mark a young woman of the respectable middle class as marriageable and culturally formed. The accomplishments are piano, watercolor, French, possibly German, needlework, and dancing. Eleanor practices piano for 1 hour every morning before lessons begin, scales, and then simple pieces, with Miss Price listening and occasionally stopping her with an again that carries more weight than any explanation could. Spoiler: Eleanor has approximately zero interest in needlework and roughly as much enthusiasm for piano as she has for the geological composition of turnips. But she does it. She does it because it is what she does, in the same way that breakfast is what you eat and prayers are what you say. The frame doesn't feel like a frame when you've never seen outside it. Eleanor will become, in all probability, quite a competent pianist and a perfectly accomplished young woman. And she will teach her own daughters the same things. And somewhere in the middle of doing so, she might occasionally sit at the piano before anyone else is up and play something that isn't a lesson piece, something she learned from listening rather than from a score, and feel, briefly, like herself. For working-class children like Hetty, education was a newer and more contested proposition. The 1870 Education Act, passed just 2 years ago, in this version of 1872, has mandated that every child in England and Wales should have access to elementary education. Schools are being built. The system is not yet universal in practice. Attendance is not yet compulsory. Fees still exist for many schools, and the labor of children is still needed by families who cannot afford to lose it. Hetty goes to a nearby board school 3 mornings a week under the half-time system. What Hetty learns is reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's, delivered with brisk practicality in a room of 40 children by a teacher with a class size that would make a modern school inspector weep. No French, no Latin, no piano, but competence with letters and numbers is, for Hetty, a form of power, the kind that doesn't require permission, that you carry in your own head and nobody can reassign. Back in the schoolroom, Edmund is conjugating amo, amas, amat for the 3rd time this week. The Latin word for I love is the first one you learn. This is either the most hopeful thing about classical education or a detail that becomes increasingly ironic, given how infrequently love and Latin lessons appear in the same sentence without the word endure in between. He is, despite everything, paying attention, because Edmund has learned that the questions that make Miss Price pause are always about the interesting parts. And there are interesting parts everywhere, even in the Latin primer. You just have to know where to look. Let's not forget the most famous instruction ever issued to a Victorian child, because it deserves its own chapter: the rule of being seen and not heard. And what it actually cost to follow it every day for the entire length of a childhood. Children should be seen and not heard is older than Victoria. It appears in various forms throughout English writing going back centuries, but the Victorians made it policy in a way that previous eras arguably didn't, embedding it in their parenting manuals, their school codes, their domestic architecture, and their general conviction that children who expressed themselves freely were children who were being done a disservice. The nursery upstairs, the drawing room below, the hour of visitation at 5 o'clock. The house itself is built to manage the problem of children being heard. The rule is about more than noise. It's about emotional expression in general. The Victorian ideal for children is restraint. Joy should be expressed modestly. Distress should be managed privately. Anger is unacceptable in almost any form. Grief and Victorian children encounter genuine grief with some regularity, given the mortality rates, should be handled with quiet composure. You are not meant to be emotional. You are meant to be forming the habit of not being emotional, so that the adult you become is the kind of person who handles things properly. Crying is complicated in this system. For very young children, crying is expected and managed. But for older children, the school-age children who are already supposed to be forming character, crying is the thing you are growing out of. There are households where a child who cries without sufficient cause is corrected for it. There are households where the only acceptable expressions of negative emotion are the formal, sanctioned ones. Prayers said privately at bedtime, confessions of specific moral failures, the careful, composed reporting of genuine injury. Edmund cried once, at 6, when the housemaid accidentally sat on a toy soldier that had been an important soldier for personal reasons he couldn't entirely articulate. He was not punished for it. But he was given a brief, practical lecture by Nanny Briggs about the nature of possessions, about not forming excessive attachments to objects that can be broken, and about how we manage our feelings when things go wrong, which is to say, quietly and in private, and then we carry on. He stopped crying. He carried on. He has thought about that soldier a few times since. The carrying on, which is what Nanny Briggs prescribed and what Edmund does, looks like this. You fold the feeling down to a small, manageable size and put it somewhere that doesn't interfere with the rest of the day. And then you get up and do the Latin and eat the mutton and go to church and say your prayers. And the folded feeling is still there when you're in the dark at 7:30. But by then, you're usually too tired to unfold it. And in the morning, there is a new day with a new schedule, and the feeling, improbably, gets smaller. This is not always healthy as a long-term strategy. It is also as a short-term strategy for a 7-year-old, with a full Latin lesson in 4 hours, quite effective. The suppression of children's emotional expression in this era is not, in most households, deliberately cruel. It is, in the language available to the adults doing it, character formation. If you can learn, at 7, to manage your distress without external expression, then at 37, you will be equipped for the losses and reversals that life, Victorian life especially, will absolutely serve you. The steel you are making now is for a purpose. And yet, children who grow up in a household where their emotional expression is systematically managed and pruned learn with great efficiency to hide what they feel. They learn to produce the approved surface and maintain the interior separately, to be seen without being known. This produces, in many cases, adults who are superbly controlled in public and have no idea what to do with themselves in private. Hetty, in the kitchen, cries when she wants to. Her tears are her own, and nobody has told her they reflect on her character. This is not because her world is kinder, it isn't, in most material ways, but because the emotional management project is specifically aimed at the class of children being prepared for social performance. Hetty's future does not require the performance. Edmund doesn't know any of this. He just knows that when he feels things too strongly, he goes and sits near Pudding, who is warm and enormous and completely indifferent to the emotional texture of the room, and who purrs in a low, continuous register that is, Edmund has found, a very reasonable substitute for being comforted. It works, more or less, most of the time. Let's set the scene. 5 o'clock. You have been upstairs since 7 this morning. You have conjugated Latin verbs, eaten boiled mutton, rested quietly in the approximate sense of the term, walked in the park with Nanny Briggs at a pace designed to improve your circulation while not encouraging you to actually enjoy the experience, and completed your afternoon copy work with the focused expression of someone who has been told that the quality of their handwriting is a reflection of their character. You are now being prepared for descent. The preparation for the 5 o'clock visit to the drawing room is its own small ritual performed by Nanny Briggs with the focused attention of a stage manager overseeing a production she knows has critics in the stalls. Your hair is combed again, your collar is adjusted, your jacket is smooth, and your face, the expression on it, is discussed briefly in terms of what is appropriate to present to your parents. Cheerful, Nanny Briggs says, not as a suggestion, and quiet. The drawing room is another world. It smells differently from the nursery. No porridge, no carbolic, no coal fire with its iron guard, but instead beeswax polish and the faint drift of your mother's scent and the paper and leather smell of your father's newspapers stacked and folded on his table beside his chair, where he sits reading with the practiced serenity of a man who has organized his household so that things are dealt with by the appropriate people. Your father is kind. He is also formally separate, as if there is a pane of glass between you that both of you understand to be correct and neither of you would think to name. You sit. You are offered the chair you always sit in, the smaller one near the window. Your father asks about your lessons. You tell him. He nods. He asks one specific question, Latin or French or history, and you answer it correctly. And he says, "Good," in a tone that contains genuine satisfaction and also signals that the topic is now complete. Your mother is more present. She takes your hand, asks about your day, tells you something brief about hers. Today she tells Edmund that she has ordered him new boots because the left one is wearing through at the toe. And this is a practical piece of information, but the way she says it, with the specific attention of someone who has noticed the thing about the left boot, lands differently than the practical words it's made of. She has been watching. She has always been watching. From the distance the household imposes. Edmund understands this later, not now. There is sometimes piano. Eleanor is occasionally asked to play, and she does, correctly, with good technique, without visible enthusiasm, and your parents listen with the expression of people hearing what they expected to hear, which is the highest form of drawing room compliment. Then Nanny Briggs appears at the door, and you stand, and you kiss your father on the cheek and your mother on the cheek, and you say good night in the correct way, and you go back upstairs. This might sound cold, the regulated visit, the 30 or 60 minutes of access before the house sorts itself back into its levels. But the feeling of it, inside the feeling of those 5 o'clock visits for the children who lived them and wrote about them in memoirs decades later, is not simple. There is something in those minutes that means something, precisely because they are contained, because your parents are dressed and present and sitting still, because the newspaper is down, because your mother is holding your hand, because your father said good and meant it. The Victorian model of parenting separates the functions. Nanny Briggs raises you. Miss Price educates you. Your parents regard you. Officially, attentively, briefly. It's not the model we'd choose now, but it is not empty. Edmund, on the stairs going back up, holds the warmth of it for a few minutes before it settles into the general temperature of the evening, and that warmth is real. They never ask a child what they want from a parent. Not in 1872, not, if you are honest about it, in every year since. Let's not forget the other side of this, because everything we've described so far, the nursery, the governess, the daily schedule, the boiled mutton is the experience of middle and upper-class children, and the Victorian era contains several entirely different childhoods happening simultaneously, stacked on top of each other in the same cities, separated by a distance. You could walk in 20 minutes, but that was, in social terms, another world entirely. Hetty Gill, whose life runs alongside Edmund's as a kind of parallel track, represents the least severe version of Victorian working-class childhood. She lives in a household. She has a parent present. She has food and shelter, and 3 mornings of school a week, and by the standards of 1,872, she is doing reasonably well. But working-class children existed on a spectrum that extended considerably further in the direction of hardship than Hetty's situation. In the mills and factories of the industrial North, children had been working alongside adults since the 18th century. The Factory Acts of 1833 and 1844 had established legal limits. Children under 9 could not work in textile factories. Those between 9 and 13 were limited to 9 hours per day, which in the listener's ears sounds like a number attached to a sentence rather than a workday, but was understood as a reform in 1833. Enforcement was patchy, and the ingenuity of employers in finding alternative arrangements was considerable. Children in the 1870s still worked. They worked in match factories, where phosphorus fumes rotted their jawbones in a condition called phossy jaw. They worked in the potteries, where clay dust built up in lungs that were still growing. They worked in agriculture, the gang system, where children as young as 4 were taken into the fields in groups, doing weeding and stone picking and harvest work from first light to last. They worked as chimney sweeps boys, small enough to fit inside flues, climbing them in the dark, absorbing soot through skin and lungs. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, which would abolish this practice, was 3 years away from where we're sitting right now in 1872. Some boys are still being sent up. The distance between Edmund's morning Latin primer, Miss Price, the schoolroom table with its china ink pot, and the morning of a 10-year-old chimney sweep 2 streets away was the full span of Victorian social possibility, and it was a span that Victorian society was very good at not looking directly at. The Victorian reformers knew this, and they were working. There was a vigorous public conversation in the 1860s and 1870s about child labor, child poverty, the moral and physical damage being done to working children, real legislation coming out of it. Shaftesbury's work on factory reform, the Ragged Schools movement, which had been running since the 1840s, offered free education to the most destitute street children, children who had no shoes and no fixed address and no prospect of a nursery or a governess or a 5 o'clock drawing room visit, and who learned to read in church halls and converted warehouses with teachers who were often volunteers. These schools were imperfect, crowded, and inconsistent. They were also, for many children who passed through them, the closest thing to an opportunity they would ever get. Barnardo's Homes, founded in 1867, worked with destitute children in the East End. The compassion was real, and the legislation was real, and slowly, very slowly, the conditions improved. Hetty knows about the chimney boys. She sees them in the street sometimes, gray from head to foot, before 7 in the morning. She is 8. She does not have a framework that includes the word injustice, but she has a feeling about it that is aimed in the correct direction. Edmund, 3 floors up, is conjugating amo, amas, amat. He does not think about the chimney boys. He has never been given occasion to. This is not cruelty on his part. He is 7, and he knows the world from inside his world, which is a universal property of being 7, regardless of the year. The gap between his world and the chimney boy's world is 1872's great, unexamined inheritance. It would be wrong to say that no one was examining it, but it would be accurate to say that the examination was not yet complete. It wouldn't be complete for quite some time. Let's talk about play, which is perhaps the most revealing thing about Victorian childhood, not because it was absent, but because of what it was allowed to be, and what the adults decided it was supposed to produce. Victorian children played. Let's be clear about this, because the image of the starched, joyless, uncreatively imprisoned Victorian child is slightly overstated. Children play because children are human beings, and human beings at 6 and 7 and 10 are constitutionally incapable of not playing, and the universe of parental restriction and nursery schedules has never yet managed to fully extinguish this particular fact about human nature. Even in the most structured Victorian household, there are windows, small, protected, or seized, or quietly disregarded, in which children are children, in the way children insist on being. What you play with matters. Victorian toys, at least for middle-class children, are instructive rather than purely entertaining where possible, because purely entertaining is a category the Victorians regarded with mild suspicion. Wooden alphabet blocks have letters on them for a reason. Dissected puzzles, what we'd call jigsaw puzzles, are maps or educational scenes, because the enjoyment of reassembly comes with geographic knowledge baked in, so even pleasure is productive. Toy soldiers are common, representing both play and the possibility of teaching military history. Dolls for girls are companions and also rehearsal, caring for something small that needs tending, dressing it correctly, managing its small household, practicing from a very young age the occupation that the decade ahead will confirm as their primary one. Edmund has toy soldiers. He has a collection of tin soldiers that he arranges on the nursery floor in formations that bear absolutely no relation to any actual military tactic, and a great deal of relation to what looked dramatic at the moment of arrangement. There are things Edmund would like to do with his soldiers that he is not permitted to do. He would like to take them outside to the garden and enact battles in the actual dirt, where the topography is interesting. He would like to involve the garden cat and see how long the formations hold. He would like to construct fortifications from real stones rather than the folded pieces of paper that are, technically, the approved material for nursery warfare. None of these things happen. The soldiers stay inside, on the floorboards, arranged with increasing sophistication within the rules of indoor operation. Edmund has become, through constraint, rather good at rules. He has a wooden hoop that he rolls in the park on the supervised walks, one of the rare moments in his day when the sheer physical pleasure of speed and momentum is allowed to operate without significant management. He has a dog-eared copy of Robinson Crusoe, which is considered suitably improving, and which Edmund loves with an intensity that has nothing to do with the improving elements and everything to do with the island. Hetty plays differently. Her toys are fewer and more improvised: a rag doll, a set of stones that function as anything she decides they are, the back courtyard of the house mapped in her mind with the territorial precision of a small general. She has a set of jump rope rhymes of significant length that she has memorized with the same thoroughness that Edmund memorizes his Latin declensions and considerably more enthusiasm. Her play is more physical, less supervised, and considerably less likely to be interpreted as building something. It is just play, the real kind, the kind that doesn't know it's supposed to be useful and therefore becomes something better. The outdoor exercise that Victorian parenting prescribes is genuine in its intention. The parks of Victorian cities are designed partly with children in mind. The open grass, the serpentine, the spaces that cities of this era are beginning to understand as necessary, and on Saturday afternoons, if Edmund has performed adequately at lessons, the walk is longer and less rigidly directed. A loosening that is small but perceptible. A version of freedom that exists within a very specific frame. The thing that Victorian childhood does not have, at least not in the nursery and schoolroom class, is unstructured time in the wild sense. The time to wander without direction, to play games nobody has taught you, to be unsupervised in a way that could be boring or could be the best afternoon of the year. Victorian adults worry about unsupervised children with a vigilance that is not simply paranoid. There are real dangers. The street is genuinely chaotic, but the effect is a childhood that is mostly monitored and mostly managed, even in its leisure moments. Pudding, who plays on no one's schedule and reports his activities to no one, sits in the nursery window and watches Edmund roll his hoop in the garden below with the expression of a being who has never once been required to account for how he uses an afternoon. And Edmund, who has had the hoop for 3 years and has gotten very good at it, rolls it back to the door with the satisfaction of a person who has found, inside the narrow window they've been given, something that is genuinely and entirely theirs. That's the thing about joy. It fits anywhere you can manage to put it. Let's be clear about Sunday. Because Sunday in a Victorian household is not a rest day. It is a different kind of work day, the kind where the work is virtue and the management of virtue and the performance of virtue in a way that is visible to God and to any member of the household who might be in a position to report back. Sunday begins earlier than weekdays in many respectable households. You are dressed with more care. In your Sunday best, the clothes kept for church, which are cleaner and stiffer and more constrictive than your everyday clothes, which were already fairly constrictive, and you attend morning church as a family. This is the only regular occasion when the nursery world and the adult world convene in the same space, side by side in the family pew, everyone in their Sunday expressions, which are the same expression for everyone, regardless of personal feeling, composed, attentive, appropriately solemn. Church is long. Church in 1872 is longer than you expect, and much longer than you want. The sermon alone can run to 45 minutes. Some clergymen consider an hour a reasonable target and achieve it without apparent remorse. You sit still. You do not fidget. You follow the service with the appropriate responses at the appropriate moments. You manage your attention with the quiet desperation of someone who has been doing this every week for as long as they can remember and has developed a set of private strategies, counting the candles, tracing the window led with your eyes, constructing small interior narratives in a part of your mind that remains technically present and at church while the rest of it has gone somewhere more interesting. The pew is also hard. It is always hard. Nobody has ever addressed this in any improving literature that Edmund has encountered, which suggests that the hardness of the pew is either considered beside the point or actively good for you, and he suspects both. Edmund is extremely good at appearing to attend church. This is, perhaps, his greatest accomplishment, and the one for which he has received the least credit. After church comes Sunday dinner, which is the best meal of the week, a proper roast with vegetables and a real pudding for dessert, because Sunday is the day the household rises slightly above the nutritional minimum. This is the one day in the week where the food at the nursery table is genuinely something to look forward to, and Edmund looks forward to it with an honesty that no Victorian improving tract has yet succeeded in redirecting. But Sunday afternoon is the test. Sunday afternoon is not available for play. It is not available for hoop rolling or toy soldiers or anything that might be described as amusement. These are secular pleasures, and Sunday is not a secular day. What is available is the Bible, which you may read, improving books, which you may read, religious literature for children, specifically the kind that features protagonists who face a moral choice between good and bad and always choose good, and then are almost immediately rewarded for choosing good, in a causal relationship that Sunday school literature presents with more confidence than real life typically supports. Edmund's current Sunday book features a boy called Herbert who is given the opportunity to steal a pie and does not, and is subsequently awarded a pony. The logic connecting these two events is presented with complete confidence. Edmund has complicated feelings about Herbert. Eleanor reads her Sunday school book with the expression of someone who has made peace with the terms of the arrangement. Edmund reads his for approximately 20 minutes and then stares at the wall for a period of time that he does not report accurately when asked how he spent his afternoon. Pudding, for whom the Sabbath means precisely nothing, is asleep in the coal-fire corner with the profound commitment of a creature who has never heard of the concept of improving oneself. Hetty's Sunday is different. She attends Sunday school in the morning, but the afternoon is her own in a way that Edmund's is not. She mostly plays in the alley behind the house with the girl from next door, which is technically not in the spirit of Sabbath observance. But the spirit of Sabbath observance has not yet reached the alley behind the house and may not be planning to send a representative. The Victorian Sunday is simultaneously the thing that holds many households together, the shared ritual, the church, the good dinner, the family walk, and the thing that makes most visible what this childhood project is actually about. Sunday is where the purpose becomes legible. The formation of a moral person, a virtuous person, a person who will grow into the kind of adult that a serious civilization considers its backbone. The backbone is uncomfortable to be some days, but it holds things up. That's the arrangement. Let's talk about what happens when a Victorian child gets sick, and let's do it with the full awareness that this is simultaneously historically significant and the chapter most likely to make you feel a warm, uncomplicated gratitude for the century you currently inhabit. The illness enters the nursery in the way illness always enters a household, quietly at first, a feverish edge to Edmund's usual morning self-possession, a lethargy that is not quite tiredness, a flush in the face that Nanny Briggs notices at precisely the moment she is trained to notice it, which is before anyone else has registered that something is wrong. She notices because noticing is her expertise, and because in a household where disease is one of the principal threats to her charge's survival, she has developed a clinical attentiveness that most Victorian doctors would recognize as professional practice. The fever has come before. It comes most winters. Edmund gets colds that settle in the chest, and Nanny Briggs manages them. Warm flannel against the body, a chest rub with camphor, the modification of meals to include more broth and less solid meat. A relaxation of the lesson schedule that Edmund is not supposed to enjoy, and definitely doesn't enjoy in any visible way. Most of these winter episodes resolve without drama. Most Victorian children in respectable households with clean water and adequate food and a competent nanny watching for symptoms do resolve. But not always. And in the nursery of 1872, the not always is something that everyone in the household carries with them as a kind of permanent weather, even when the sun is out. The doctor arrives when Nanny Briggs is uncertain, which doesn't happen often. Doctor Renwick is a man of 50 with a black bag and a careful manner, with diagnostic tools considerably more sophisticated than what was available 30 years ago, but still, by the standard of what's coming in the next century, operating in a significant amount of darkness. He prescribes rest, broth, possibly a calomel purge if the fever does not break in 2 days, and a calming draught to manage the nighttime restlessness. The calming draught contains a small amount of laudanum. This is standard. Edmund sleeps. He sleeps a great deal because he is genuinely unwell, and also because the laudanum encourages it, and also because there is nothing else to do in a sick nursery in 1872 except lie there and be managed. Pudding moves from his usual spots to the end of Edmund's bed and stays there for the duration, either affection or the identification of a warm, flat surface, and nobody in the nursery is prepared to definitively call it one thing or the other. The fever breaks after 3 days. Edmund is thin and slightly washed out and extremely pleased to have the Latin primer back, which surprises him almost as much as it surprises Miss Price. Nanny Briggs, who has barely slept in 3 days, resumes her normal schedule with the same implacable efficiency she brings to everything, and the closest thing she shows to relief is a slightly different quality of silence when she does the morning check and finds the fever gone. The convalescence has its own texture that Edmund will remember separately from the illness itself, the specific quality of the afternoon light when you have been lying still for 3 days and the world outside the window seems to be moving at a slightly faster speed than you are. The way soup tastes like something when you have not tasted anything for 2 days. The strange tenderness toward ordinary things that returns along with the appetite. The sense of the morning as something worth noting. Here is the weight underneath all of this. In 1872, roughly 1 in every 5 children born does not reach their 5th birthday. Scarlet fever kills children who were perfectly well last week. Diphtheria closes the throat with a membrane that cannot be treated in 1872. The antitoxin is 20 years away. Every Victorian household that has children has, somewhere in its recent history, a child it lost. The smallness of the headstones in Victorian cemeteries, the number of them, the dates carved so close together on some family monuments, That is the arithmetic of this reality. Nanny Briggs has nursed 3 children through fatal illnesses in her 30 years of service. She has never discussed this with any person now living. It is in her somewhere, the weight of it, the competence that grew out of necessity, the morning check that is never casual, not once, not in 30 years. Edmund, sitting up in bed on the 4th day and asking for his toy soldiers, does not know any of this. He knows he is better, and that the broth today was thicker than the broth yesterday, and that pudding is still on the end of the bed, and that the Latin primer has a picture of a Roman aqueduct in the introduction that he never noticed before. He will remember this illness in a way he doesn't remember being well, the way the light looked through the curtain in the afternoon. The sound of Nanny Briggs's footsteps on the floorboards at 2 in the morning, checking on him, the aqueduct. Some things settle in you when you're still. That is not nothing. Let's talk about love, because Victorian childhood was full of it, not in the shape we expect, not spoken in the sentences we'd use, not organized the way we'd organize it, but present, specific, and in certain moments, startlingly clear, like a light coming through a narrow gap in a very solid wall. The love in Edmund's nursery world is distributed across several people who do not describe what they feel as love, because describing internal states with that word is not a Victorian recreational activity, and certainly not between adults and children in households where the correct emotional register is composed equanimity. But it is there nonetheless, recognizable once you know what you're looking for, a slightly different quality in the air around certain decisions, a care that exceeds what duty strictly requires. Nanny Briggs, who washes his face in cold water every morning and has done for 7 years, who corrects his posture without anger, who checks on him at 2 in the morning when he is feverish and never mentions having done so, who knows that he hides things under the window seat cushion and removes them with regular thoroughness, but has never removed the small sketch he drew of pudding that is folded under the leftmost corner, because she recognized it as something he needed to keep and made a private decision that it wasn't her business. She would not describe this as love. She would describe it as appropriate professional care. The difference between these two things, if you press on it, is smaller than you'd think. Miss Price, who paused when Edmund asked his question about Caesar and answered it fully, and returned to the Latin conjugation, but who has remembered the question and in subsequent lessons occasionally introduces a detail that she knows will catch on that particular type of mind. She does not say she likes teaching him better than she expected to, but she chooses her examples with a care that is specific to the student in front of her, and this is, in the language available to a governess in 1872, a form of recognition that is close enough to warmth to count. Eleanor, 11, who descends to the nursery on Saturday afternoons sometimes and plays card games with Edmund that she pretends are educational, because that's the easiest way to maintain them without explanation. She pretends not to enjoy this. Edmund knows she enjoys this. Neither of them mentions it. This is, in a Victorian household, an expression of genuine sibling warmth, and it works perfectly well within its own logic. Hetty, who is not supposed to be in the nursery, who appears there anyway, who showed Edmund last autumn how to make a whistle from a piece of grass and watched him fail at it approximately 14 times with the patient expression of someone who knew he'd get it eventually and was willing to wait. Their friendship is odd and irregular and slightly against the rules of everything, and it is probably the most honest relationship in Edmund's life, because neither of them is performing for it. In a childhood full of managed surfaces, 15 minutes of being a person rather than a project is its own kind of extraordinary gift.
Mrs.
Gill, Hetty's mother, is a warm presence in the background of this friendship. She sends Hetty up with trays a little more often than is strictly necessary, and the trays sometimes include something extra, a biscuit or a small apple tucked in the corner without comment, in the way that generous people have always found to give things without requiring anyone to be grateful about it. Baby Clara, who doesn't know any of the rules yet, who reaches for Edmund's face with both hands when he leans over the cradle, who is all warmth and demand and the startling particularity of her small existence. He comes to the cradle every morning and makes the face that makes her respond, and Nanny Briggs does not correct this. Because even in 1872, a big brother leaning over a baby's cradle is something that gets left alone. And Pudding, who chooses Edmund's bed and Edmund's company with a consistency that is probably explained by warmth and biscuit proximity, but might also just be preference, because cats do apparently have those. Even cats in 1872 who have never been asked about them. In the end, a childhood is not the rules that organize it. It is the people who are in it, and what they do when nobody is watching, and what stays. Edmund will carry Nanny Briggs for the rest of his life in the way you carry the things that are simply always there when you open the morning. He will carry Miss Price as the person who answered the question properly. He will carry Hetty as the first person who was ever just a person to him, without the visit requiring anything else of the situation. He will carry all of this without knowing, for many years, that he is carrying it. That's how it works, usually. You only find out later what was holding you up. Let's not forget the books. Because in an era that has discovered both childhood and the printing press, and is using them in combination with the enthusiasm of someone who has found two ingredients that go spectacularly together, the Victorian child's reading life is a thing of considerable range, from the genuinely wonderful to the aggressively improving, with a lot of territory in between that can only be described as well-intentioned hostility to fun. The Victorian children's publishing industry is, by 1872, in full swing. This is the era of Lewis Carroll's Alice, published in 1865, and already a phenomenon, already sitting on bookshelves next to more earnest works with the subversive energy of something that wasn't supposed to happen. Edward Lear's nonsense poetry is being read and genuinely loved. George MacDonald's At the Back of the North Wind appeared just a year ago, a book of genuine and slightly uncanny beauty that does not resolve into a lesson the way the improving literature resolves into a lesson. The era is producing real children's literature, literature that respects children's imaginations, that trusts them with strangeness and the genuinely weird texture of being small in a large world. Edmund has Alice. He has read it 4 times. He tells no one about this because Alice is not an improving book in any way that Nanny Briggs can readily identify, and the 4th reading was conducted under the bedclothes with a candle stub, which is technically against the rules of multiple categories simultaneously. But alongside Alice, the Victorian child's reading world is populated with an extraordinary quantity of cautionary literature. These are books about children who make a wrong moral choice and then suffer consequences that are, on reflection, significantly disproportionate to the infraction. The moral machinery of these stories is absolute and fast: sin, consequence, either rapid redemption or death, with very little intermediate territory. The children who don't survive are presented not as tragedies, but as illustrations, which is a literary mode that the 21st century has largely abandoned, and for which I think we can mostly be grateful. Struwwelpeter, the German children's book by Heinrich Hoffmann, published in 1845 and wildly popular across Europe, is perhaps the ur-text of this genre. Little Pauline, who plays with matches, burns entirely to death. Little Augustus, who refuses to eat his soup, withers away over several illustrated weeks until he is dead. Conrad, who sucks his thumbs, has them cut off by a giant tailor with massive scissors, presented in cheerful rhyme with extremely committed illustration. Children loved these books. Adults thought they were teaching something. What they were teaching is a subject for a slightly different kind of analysis. The domestic moral tales were more modest in their violence, but equally committed to the principle. Mrs. Sherwood's The Fairchild Family, one of the most popular children's books of the early Victorian era, takes its young protagonists to look at the body of a man hanged for murder as an educational outing. The educational point is about the wages of sin. The psychological effect on the children reading the book is, one assumes, variable. Edmund reads what he is given and processes the cautionary tales with the private realism of a 7-year-old who understands that Augustus's parents were not monitoring his soup situation carefully enough, and that this seems like an administrative failure more than a moral one. He reads Alice when he can, because Alice does not have a lesson in the sense the improving books mean a lesson. It has something else, a dream logic, a freedom from consequence, a world that follows rules, but not anyone's actual rules. When Edmund finishes Alice, he puts it down and lies on his back on the nursery floor for a moment, looking at the ceiling, and there is a feeling he gets at the end of it every time that he cannot name exactly. It is not happiness and not sadness, but something that contains both, the specific feeling of having been somewhere and returned, which is perhaps what all the best stories do to you, and which no improving literature has ever come close to producing, which is possibly the point. Miss Price has Alice on her bookshelf. She read it when it came out. She thought it was funny in places that surprised her. She thought the Mad Hatter's Tea Party was the most accurate description she had ever encountered of a formal social gathering with no real purpose, organized by people who had forgotten why they started. She has never said this to anyone. She keeps it, with a few other things, in the private register of thoughts that stay thoughts, which is itself a very Victorian thing to do, and also just a very human thing to do, and you suspect the line between the two is thinner than Victorian people were ever told. Let's talk about what they dreamed of, because everyone inside a system has, at some level, a dream of outside it. And Victorian children, despite the careful management of their imaginations toward improving ends, were no exception, and their escape fantasies are more specific and more moving than you might expect. For Edmund, the escape fantasy is the island. Robinson Crusoe's island, specifically the one from the book he is allowed to read because it is improving, which is to say, self-reliance and industry are its explicit values, but which Edmund has read at a slight angle to those values, attending instead to the fundamental proposition, a person alone, in a place with no rules, making all the decisions, no schedule. No Latin primer, no cold basin in the morning, nobody's expression to manage, just the island, and whatever you decide to do with it. He has, in the garden at the back of the house during the supervised Saturday walk, identified a section of wall near the kitchen garden that receives the afternoon sun and is, if you sit against it at the right time of day, warm and private in a way that the rest of the garden isn't. It is not an island. It is a 6-square-foot section of Victorian walled garden that smells of cabbage and brick dust. But Edmund has decided it is the island, and on the afternoons when the walk permits it and Nanny Briggs has looked the other way long enough, he goes there and sits against the warm stone, and the island is real in those minutes in a way that nothing requiring explanation ever quite is. For Eleanor, the escape fantasy is harder to name because Eleanor is 11 and already knows more about the shape of her future than Edmund knows about his, and the shape of her future is knowable in a way that boys' futures are not. She will be educated to accomplishment level. She will be brought out into society at the appropriate age. She will marry. She will manage a household. She will repeat the whole process from the other side of the table. This is not presented to her as a threat. It is simply the way things go. But in the late afternoons before the drawing room visit, Eleanor sometimes sits at the schoolroom piano and plays things she has taught herself, not the lesson pieces, not the scales, but something she heard once from a visiting cousin who played with a freedom that the lesson book never produced, loose and rhythmic and slightly wrong by Miss Price's standards, and completely right by some other standard that Eleanor cannot name but can feel, in the way you can feel a key, before you know it, fits a lock. In those pieces, there is something that is not going the way things go. She is not sure she has named it yet, but it's there, in the music, in the afternoons, in the space between one version of a life and whatever else there might be. Hetty's escape fantasy is more concrete, a position in a good household. Not the one she's in now, which is fine, but not exciting, a proper position as a lady's maid in a household where you travel, where you see things. Hetty has a specific and practical imagination that has always been directed outward, toward the world, and her version of escape is not away from structure, but toward more interesting structure, toward a life that moves. She has heard from the under-housemaid that there are positions where you go to the country house in summer and the London house in autumn and occasionally abroad. And abroad is a word that Hetty turns over in her mind the way Edmund turns over the Latin word for table, slightly wrong for what it contains, but interesting precisely because of the gap between the word and the world it points at. The Victorians were genuinely ambivalent about daydreaming. The moral literature worried about it. But the same culture was producing Alice and Lear and MacDonald, producing a fantasy literature in which the escape from the real world was the whole point. And the contradiction between these two positions was never quite resolved, because it's a contradiction that's in the nature of things, in human nature itself. You can manage the imagination. You can point it, constrain it, give it approved materials, but it goes where it goes. Edmund sits against the wall in the garden and thinks about the island. Hetty thinks about abroad. Eleanor plays her private piece at the schoolroom piano and stops when she hears footsteps on the stair. Pudding dreams about something he twitches in his sleep in the warm coal-fire corner, his paws moving, his whiskers flickering at something only he can see. Whatever Pudding's island is, he seems to be running toward it with conviction, which is, in its way, a perfectly satisfying place to leave a chapter. Let's step back for a moment. Because stepping back and looking at the whole picture of Victorian childhood, the cold baths and the Latin primer and the teething drops and the chimney boys and the cautionary tales about children who burn to death for playing with matches produces a feeling that is not quite pity, not quite admiration, but something that sits in the space between them and looks steadily in both directions. These children were tougher than us. This is not a romantic claim about adversity building character, though adversity did build character, sometimes at considerable cost to the people doing the building. It is an observation about what it takes to maintain a working self inside conditions that by our current standards would activate every safeguarding system available. They maintained those selves. Not always intact. Not always without cost, but they maintained them with ingenuity and human connection and the small private rebellions that keep the self alive in constrained systems, and the particular talent that children have always had for finding the space between the rules and living in it with complete conviction. Edmund, at 7, has already learned to locate joy in the narrow windows available to it. The Saturday afternoon sun on the garden wall, the Latin word that sounds wrong for the thing it names. The 15 minutes with Hetty before Nanny Briggs comes back, Pudding's weight at the end of the bed. These are not grand freedoms. They are the size of what's available, and he has learned to fill them completely, which is a skill that takes adults most of a lifetime to develop, and which children inside constrained systems often develop early by the particular necessity of having no other choice. The working children, the Hettys, and the children further along the spectrum, the factory children, the chimney boys, the field gang children, exercised a different and harder version of this. They had less time, more physical demand, greater exposure to adult cruelty and adult poverty, and the full weight of a society's structural indifference. And they survived in larger numbers than you'd expect, producing adults who built things and organized things and went on strike for things and eventually produced the labor movement and the reforms that slowly, imperfectly, generation by generation, made the next childhood a bit less brutal, and the one after that a bit less still. The Victorian child who survived to adulthood and looked back was, in many memoirs, oddly unbitter. There's a notable pattern in Victorian autobiography of people remembering their childhoods, the cold baths, the governess, the Sunday afternoons. The cauliflower without sauce with something close to fondness. Not for the hardship specifically, but for the texture of it. The specific people. The specific rooms. The smell of the nursery coal fire. Nanny Briggs's starched cap. The way the light moved through the nursery window in a particular season. These are the things that survive, long after the rules that organized those days have been revised, debated, and occasionally apologized for. Because what childhood produces what it has always produced, in every era, under every system of rules and regulations and improving intentions, is memory. The vivid, particular, irreplaceable memory of being small and alive in a specific time and place, with specific people around you who were doing their best with what they had. The Victorians were doing their best with what they had. Their best was complicated, and sometimes wrong, and occasionally actively harmful. But it was genuine, and the children who grew up inside it grew up knowing they were attended to, which is a form of love even when it doesn't look like love in the shape we'd expect. Nanny Briggs knows one thing with absolute certainty. A child needs to be warm, clean, fed, and consistent. If you can give a child those 4 things every single day, without exception, you are doing something real. The philosophy on top of that is variable. The doctrine changes. The improving literature comes and goes, but warm, clean, fed, and consistent, that doesn't change. That's what she gives. That's what she has always given. Edmund is warm. Edmund is clean. Edmund is fed on plain food that he has opinions about and is not allowed to express. Edmund is consistent, more consistent than he knows, because he doesn't have the comparison point yet. He just has today, and yesterday, and the day before, and Nanny Briggs at the foot of the bed every morning, and pudding on the pillow when nobody is watching, and Hetty with her 15 minutes, and her whistle of grass, and Miss Price, who pauses when the question is good, and Eleanor, who plays cards on Saturday and pretends she doesn't want to, and baby Clara, who reaches for his face, and the warm wall in the garden that is also, secretly, the island. In 1872, that counts as a triumph, and, in most ways, quietly and genuinely, it still does. So here you are, still breathing, still warm, which is, given everything we've been through together this evening, genuinely impressive. You have survived the cold basin and the boiled mutton and the gray porridge and the Latin primer and Miss Price's expression when you declined to conjugate amo correctly on the first attempt. You have made it through the Sunday afternoon with its improving books and its silence and its complete absence of hoop rolling. You have sat through the 5 o'clock drawing room visit and kept both elbows off the table at dinner and said your evening prayers in the correct order without prompting. You have been cold and stiffly dressed and managed within an inch of your life and managed still further, and you are still here, which would earn you a single quiet nod of acknowledgement from Nanny Briggs. And, if you have been paying attention, you know by now that a quiet nod from Nanny Briggs is the highest available denomination. Take it. You've earned it. Because here's the thing about all those Victorian children, Edmund and Eleanor and Hetty and baby Clara, and the thousands of real children whose names appear in census records and church registers and factory inspection reports and charity school logs, whose photographs look at us from old albums with eyes that are serious and curious and very much alive. They were not tragic. Not primarily. They were alive. They were curious and resilient and sneaky about the candle stubs and affectionate in the constrained ways available to them, and they felt things that the rules said they shouldn't feel and went ahead and felt them anyway. In the privacy of their own interiors, in the 15 minutes between tray deliveries, in the warm corner of the garden wall, in the piece they played on the piano before anyone else was up. They loved their nannies and their siblings and their cats and their scraps of private freedom. They grew up and became the adults who built the 20th century, who fought for reforms and produced children of their own, who they raised slightly differently, having quietly observed what worked and what didn't, as every generation does. They were doing the best they could with what they had. And what they had was genuinely hard. And they were, unmistakably and in every moment, human, doing the whole ordinary, extraordinary thing of being alive inside whatever era they were born into, and making of it whatever they could manage. Now, look around you. You are not in the nursery. There is no Nanny Briggs at the foot of your bed. You have not been corrected for your posture in some time, and whatever you ate today, I'm willing to wager it had opinions about itself. You are lying in a bed with a mattress that does not bite back, in a room you chose, under blankets that are the temperature you prefer, at an hour that is yours to determine. There is no cold basin waiting for you in the morning. There are antibiotics, if you need them, and doctors who understand germ theory, and the extraordinary accumulated wisdom of a century and a half of people who looked at Victorian childhood and said, "We can do better than this," and then, slowly, imperfectly, tried. There is someone, in all probability, who would describe themselves as loving you in direct and uncomplicated modern English, without any of the Victorian stylistic constraints we've been navigating all evening. That's quite a lot. That's actually an extraordinary amount, viewed from the third floor of a terraced house in Kensington in 1872. History has a way of making your present moment feel both very small and very large at the same time. Small, because it is one moment in a very long chain of moments. Large because you are the one who is alive in it right now, which is not something to take entirely for granted. Every era has its cold basins, its improving literature, its rules about what you're allowed to feel and where. We are not exempt from having our version. But tonight, you are comfortable, and that is worth something. Edmund would have considered it paradise. Close your eyes. You're done for the evening. The nursery is quiet, and Pudding has found the warmest spot, and Nanny Briggs has made the last check and found everything in order. And outside, London is settling into its Victorian night. The gas lamps coming on in the fog, the distant horse traffic, the long story of the world still going, as it always does, as it always has. You are not there, though. You are here, in the warmth, in the dark, in the very good luck of the present moment. Sleep well.